The silence that fell over the dining room at Oakhurst Hall was not the comfortable silence of satiated guests or the respectful hush that accompanied a toast. It was the silence of 23 people watching a man drown on dry land. Count Voronov had arrived that afternoon from St. Petersburg, bearing letters of introduction from the Foreign Secretary himself, and a command of English that had, over the course of 4 hours, revealed itself to be considerably less fluent than his correspondence had suggested. By the second course, he had abandoned attempts at conversation entirely. By the third, he sat with his hands folded beneath the table, his expression fixed in that particular mask of dignified suffering that belongs to a man who understands he is being discussed but cannot parse the words. Lady Arabella Sinclair, seated at the Duke of Oakhurst's right hand, the position she had occupied since their engagement, was announced 3 months prior, and which she inhabited with the settled confidence of a woman who considered it already hers by permanent right, leaned toward the Dowager Viscountess beside her and murmured something behind her glass. The Viscountess smiled. 2 seats further, Mrs. Pemberton Hale covered her mouth with her napkin. The laughter moved down the table like a draught beneath a door, invisible but felt. Benedict Oakhurst, 6th Duke of Oakhurst, did not laugh. He watched Count Voronov reach for his wine glass and drink from it slowly, deliberately, and recognized the gesture for what it was. A man giving his hand something to do because his mouth had failed him. Benedict had seen the same gesture at the House of Lords, performed by men whose command of English was flawless, but whose command of the chamber was not. The drink bought time. The drink said, "I am still here. I have not retreated." He was composing a sentence, something in the schoolroom French that was the only language besides English he possessed, which he suspected would not serve, given that Count Voronov's letters had been written in English precisely because his French was reportedly worse, when the door to the serving corridor opened and the girl came in carrying the sauce-boat. She was not supposed to be in the dining room. Benedict knew this because he knew, in the manner of a man who had inherited an estate of 400 acres and 67 staff at the age of 22, and had spent the subsequent 8 years learning that competence required attention, exactly which servants worked which rooms. The dining room was Footman Selby's province, assisted by James and the under-butler. The girl carrying the sauce-boat was a maid, one of the upper housemaids, he thought, though he could not have named her. She was slight, dark-haired, perhaps 23 or 24, and she moved with the particular unobtrusiveness that marked a servant who had been well trained or who had trained herself, which were not always the same thing. She set the sauce-boat beside Count Voronov's plate, and then she spoke to him. The words were not English, they were not French. Benedict did not recognize them at all for the first several syllables, and then the shape of them resolved. Russian. She was speaking Russian. Quietly, without raising her eyes to the table at large, her body still oriented in the posture of service, slightly inclined, hands clasped, but the words were fluent and unhesitating, and Count Voronov's face underwent a transformation so complete it was almost indecent to witness. The mask dissolved. Beneath it was a man of perhaps 55, tired from travel, grateful beyond all proportion to hear his own tongue in a stranger's house in a foreign county in England. He replied. She answered. The exchange lasted perhaps 15 seconds, no longer than it would take to inquire whether the sauce was to his liking and to receive his assurance that it was. But the Russian flowed between them like water finding its level, and every person at that table heard it. The silence that followed was different from the one that had preceded it. This one had a texture. Benedict could feel the table recalibrating, the rapid, invisible arithmetic of rank and expectation that governed every social gathering of this kind. A maid had spoken, in Russian, to a count, at the Duke's table. The arithmetic did not balance. Lady Arabella laughed. It was not a cruel laugh precisely. It was worse than that. It was the laugh of genuine amusement, bright, musical, the laugh she deployed at balls and assemblies, the laugh that had been one of the first things Benedict had noticed about her, before he had understood that it was not a response, but a tool. She turned to Mrs. Pemberton Hale and said clearly enough for the table to hear, "Good heavens, the sauce-boat speaks Russian. What next? Shall the candlesticks recite Homer?" Mrs. Pemberton Hale laughed. The Viscountess laughed. 3 others followed. The sound moved down the table again, and this time it had edges. The girl did not flinch. Benedict watched for it, watched her hands, her shoulders, the line of her jaw, and saw nothing. No color rose in her cheeks. Her expression did not shift. She inclined her head very slightly in the way that a servant acknowledges an instruction and stepped back from the table. She did not look at Lady Arabella. She did not look at Benedict. She turned and walked to the serving corridor door with the same measured, unhurried step with which she had entered, and the door closed behind her without sound. Benedict set down his fork. The pheasant on his plate had been carved beautifully. Rawlings ran the household with a precision that Benedict had never had cause to question, but he found he could not eat it. He looked at the place where the girl had stood. He looked at Count Voronoff, who had lowered his eyes to his plate, and whose gratitude had curdled into something closer to shame, because the person who had helped him had been punished for it in front of him, and he knew it. He looked at Lady Arabella, who was smiling at the Viscountess, her color high, her eyes bright with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has said something clever and heard it confirmed by laughter. He had proposed to her in March. It was now September. In 6 months he had introduced her to his household, his tenants, his neighbors, his steward, his solicitor, and the members of his acquaintance whose opinions he valued. He had watched her move through these introductions with grace and confidence and charm, and had felt each time the quiet confirmation that he had chosen well. He was 30 years old. His mother had been dead since he was 12. The estate needed a duchess. Lady Arabella was the daughter of an earl, educated, accomplished, handsome, and possessed of exactly the social fluency that Oakhurst Hall required. The match was appropriate. The match was advantageous. The match was everything a man in his position was expected to seek. He looked at the closed door to the serving corridor. He looked at his fiancée, and he understood, with the particular clarity that arrives not as revelation, but as recognition, as though one were seeing for the first time something that had always been present, that the match was wrong. Not because she had laughed, because she had laughed at that. He sent for Mrs. Croft the following morning. The housekeeper arrived in his study within 6 minutes. She was, like Rawlings, a model of efficiency, and Benedict had inherited her along with the estate and the portraits and the particular draft in the east corridor that no amount of renovation seemed to cure. "The maid who served at dinner last night," he said, "the one who spoke to Count Voronoff." Mrs. Croft's expression did not change, but something behind it shifted, a repositioning, as though she were selecting which of several prepared responses to deploy. "That would be Eliza Dunmore, Your Grace, upper housemaid. She's been with us 11 months. Why was she in the dining room?" "James took ill before the second course, Your Grace. Eliza was nearest to hand, and Selby called her in. It will not happen again." "That is not my concern." Benedict paused. He was aware that the question he was about to ask would be noted, interpreted, and, within the particular economy of a household's internal intelligence, circulated. He asked it anyway. "Russian. Where did she learn Russian?" The shift behind Mrs. Croft's expression became more pronounced. "Her father was a clergyman, Your Grace, the Reverend Josiah Dunmore. He held the living at St. Michael's in Hertfordshire for 26 years. He was a scholar of some reputation, I understand, languages and classical texts. He taught her himself." "Russian is not a classical language, Mrs. Croft." "No, Your Grace, but Reverend Dunmore had broader interests, I am told. Eliza, Miss Dunmore, is proficient in French, Italian, German, Russian, Latin, and Greek. 6 languages, Your Grace, if one includes English." Benedict said nothing for a moment. 6 languages. An upper housemaid in his establishment, making beds and polishing silver and carrying coal scuttles up 3 flights of stairs every morning, spoke 6 languages. He had hired tutors. He had attended Eton and Oxford. He spoke English and indifferent French. "Her father died?" 4 years ago, Your Grace. The living passed to a new incumbent. There was no provision for the family. Miss Dunmore's mother had died some years before. She entered service because there was no other respectable course available to her." "She has no family?" "A brother, I believe, in the Navy. She does not speak of him often." Benedict looked at the window. The gardens beyond were in their late September decline. The roses finished, the dahlias still holding the light, that particular golden amber that arrived each year at this time, and made the stone of the house look as though it were lit from within. He thought of the girl standing beside Count Voronov's chair, her voice low and fluent and unhesitating. He thought of her stepping back from the table without flinching. He thought of the composure it required to be laughed at by a room full of people who held power over your livelihood and your position and your daily bread, and to show nothing. "Thank you, Mrs. Croft. That will be all." "Your Grace." She turned at the door. "Shall I speak to her? About last night?" "No," Benedict said. "You shall not." He did not seek her out. That would have been improper, and worse than improper, it would have been unkind, because a duke seeking out a housemaid carried implications that could not be retracted, and he would not place her in that position. But he found, in the days that followed, that the architecture of his own house seemed to rearrange itself so that their paths crossed with a frequency that could not be entirely coincidental on his part, however much he pretended otherwise. He encountered her in the library on the third morning. She was dusting the upper shelves, a task that required the rolling ladder which she navigated with the same quiet competence she brought to everything else, and she did not hear him enter. He stood in the doorway and watched her hand pause on the spine of a book. It was Herodotus, the Greek edition. Her fingers rested on it for a moment longer than dusting required, and then she moved on, and he understood that she touched the book she could read the way a prisoner might touch a window, not to open it, but to remember that the world beyond it existed. He cleared his throat. She startled, barely, a slight catch in her breath, and descended the ladder with the controlled haste of a servant discovered somewhere she had every right to be, but felt, nonetheless, caught. "Your Grace, I beg your pardon. I was instructed to—" "You are doing your work, Miss Dunmore. There is nothing to pardon." The name stopped her. Servants in houses like Oakhurst Hall were called by their surname alone, or, if they were below a certain rank, by their Christian name, which was not intimacy but its opposite, the erasure of formality that accompanied the erasure of status. Miss Dunmore was neither. It was what she would have been called in her father's parish, in her father's world, before that world collapsed. She looked at him directly for the first time. Her eyes were dark, brown so deep it approached black, and the expression in them was not gratitude or surprise or any of the things he might have expected. It was assessment. She was measuring him, deciding what this meant, what it cost, what it required of her. "Your Grace," she said again, and the words were the same, but the weight of them had shifted. He asked her about the Herodotus. She answered carefully at first, the cautious, truncated responses of a woman who had learned that displaying intelligence in her current position invited mockery at best and hostility at worst. But he asked specific questions, and specificity is difficult to answer with generalities, and within 10 minutes she was speaking about Herodotus's account of the Persian Wars with a fluency and a precision that would have distinguished her at any Oxford dinner table. Her father had believed, she told him, that a mind required exercise in the same way a body did, and that the exercise of translation, the act of finding the precise equivalent of a thought in a different tongue, was the finest sharpening stone available. Benedict listened. He had been educated expensively and thoroughly, and he knew, had always known, in the way that honest men know things about themselves that they would prefer not to, that his intelligence was competent rather than exceptional. He was a good landlord. He was a responsible member of the House of Lords. He would, he believed, be a decent father. But he was not a scholar, and he had never pretended otherwise. Listening to Eliza Dunmore speak about language with the offhand authority of someone for whom 6 tongues were simply the furniture of her mind, he felt not inadequacy, but recognition. This is what it looks like when a thing is real. He thanked her and left. She returned to her dusting. Neither of them mentioned it again. But the following morning, he left a volume of Thucydides on the library table with a slip of paper marking the passage he had attempted to read the previous evening and abandoned. When he returned that afternoon, the slip of paper had been moved to the final page, and beside it, in a hand that was neat and small and unapologetic, she had written a translation of the passage he had marked, and beneath it, a single line. "The Greek does not say what your English edition claims. The word is closer to restraint than cowardice. It changes the meaning entirely. He read it twice. He sat down in the chair beside the window and read it a third time. Then he folded the paper and placed it in his breast pocket, where it remained for the rest of the day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Lady Arabella noticed. Of course she noticed. She was not a foolish woman. Benedict had never thought her foolish, and did not think so now. She was accomplished and perceptive, and she had spent her entire life learning to read the currents of social power the way a sailor reads the wind, and she could feel the shift in him the way one feels the barometric pressure drop before a storm, not visible, not audible, but present in the body nonetheless. She responded as she always responded to threats, by performing harder. She became more attentive at meals, more charming with his guests, more visible in the running of the household, directing flowers, consulting with cook about menus, rearranging the drawing-room furniture with an authority that was, technically, not yet hers. She touched his arm more frequently. She laughed more brightly. She mentioned the wedding, December, they had agreed, at the chapel on the estate, with increasing specificity, the flowers, the music, the guest list, the dress, and she found reasons to correct Eliza Dunmore. The corrections were never overt. Lady Arabella was too intelligent for overt cruelty in front of Benedict. She had registered that the dinner incident had landed differently than she intended, though she had not, he suspected, understood precisely why. Instead, the corrections arrived through Mrs. Croft, through Rawlings, through the small bureaucracy of household management. Miss Dunmore's work in the morning room was inadequate. Miss Dunmore had left a smudge on the silver in the breakfast room. Miss Dunmore had been seen reading in the servants' corridor during hours when she should have been occupied. Benedict heard about these corrections the way he heard about most things that happened in his household, through the estate's internal currents, which carried information with the same reliability and approximately the same speed as the postal service. Rawlings mentioned, in the careful, neutral tone he used when he wished to convey information without appearing to offer an opinion, that Miss Dunmore had received 3 formal reprimands in the past fortnight. From whom? From Mrs. Croft, Your Grace, at Lady Arabella's suggestion. Were the reprimands warranted? Rawlings paused. The pause was, in itself, an answer. Miss Dunmore's work has been exemplary since her arrival, Your Grace. Mrs. Croft has said so on several occasions. Thank you, Rawlings. He found Eliza in the kitchen garden that afternoon, during the half-hour between the clearing of luncheon and the preparation for tea that represented, for upper housemaids, the closest thing to liberty the day offered. She was sitting on the stone bench beside the herb beds, with her hands folded in her lap, and her face turned toward the sun, and she looked, for the first and only time in his observation of her, tired. Not physically tired, though the work was physical. Tired in the way that a person grows tired of maintaining composure under sustained assault, the way a wall grows tired of holding back water, not cracking, not failing, but aware at every moment of the pressure. She stood when she saw him. He gestured for her to sit. She remained standing. He understood. She could not sit in his presence without invitation, and the invitation, if accepted, would be observed, and the observation would reach Lady Arabella within the hour. She was protecting herself. She was protecting him. I am told you have received several reprimands, he said. My work has been found wanting, Your Grace. Has it? She looked at him, that same direct assessing gaze. I would not presume to contradict Mrs. Croft. I am not asking you to contradict Mrs. Croft. I am asking you whether your work has been wanting. A pause. He watched the calculation happen, the rapid weighing of honesty against prudence, of dignity against survival. She chose honesty. She chose it, he thought, the way her father must have chosen it, not because it was safe, but because it was correct. No, Your Grace. It has not. Thank you, Miss Dunmore. I shall not trouble you further. He walked back to the house and went directly to the morning room, where Lady Arabella was writing letters at the desk she had claimed 6 weeks ago. She looked up with the smile she had perfected, warm, welcoming, the smile of a woman secure in her position. Benedict. I was just writing to Mama about the reprimands will stop, he said. The smile held, but the warmth behind it emptied. I beg your pardon? Miss Dunmore's work is exemplary. Mrs. Croft has confirmed this. Whatever complaints have been brought are without foundation, and they will stop." Lady Arabella set down her pen. "I hardly think that the management of your household servants is a matter for— It is a matter for me because it is my household." The sentence landed in the room like a stone in water. The ripples moved outward. He watched her register it, not just the words, but the weight of them, the boundary they drew, the territory they reclaimed. This was his house. These were his servants. She was a guest in both senses of the word. "Of course," she said. Her voice was even. Her color was high. "Of course, Benedict. I only meant to help." He inclined his head and left. The reprimand stopped. But he had seen her face in the moment between the sentence and the recovery, and what he had seen there was not embarrassment or contrition. It was fury. Controlled, contained, immaculate fury. The fury of a woman who understood that she was losing something and could not, for the first time in her life, identify the mechanism by which it was being taken. He ended the engagement on a Tuesday. He chose Tuesday because it was the day Lady Arabella's mother, the Countess, habitually received callers, which meant that Lady Arabella could depart Oakhurst Hall and arrive at her mother's house without the awkwardness of an unannounced visit. He had thought about this. He had thought about all of it, the logistics, the social consequences, the financial implications, the conversations he would need to have with his solicitor and with the handful of friends whose opinions he valued. He had thought about it for 19 days, which was the length of time between the dinner with Count Voronoff and the morning he woke, and understood that further deliberation was not decision-making, but cowardice, and that the word, as Eliza had taught him, was closer to restraint than to cowardice, but in this case the Greek was wrong. He told her in the library. He chose the library because it was private, because it had 2 doors. She could leave without passing through the main hall, and because it was, whether he admitted this to himself or not, the room where he had first heard Eliza speak about something she loved. Lady Arabella received the news in silence. He had expected argument. She was a woman of considerable rhetorical ability, and she had, he knew, invested not merely her affections, but her social capital, her family's expectations, and her own considerable ambitions in this match. He had prepared for argument. He had not prepared for silence. She sat in the chair across from his desk and looked at him for a long time. Her face was perfectly composed. He gave her credit for that, but her hands, folded in her lap in an unconscious mirror of the posture Eliza had held in the kitchen garden, trembled very slightly. "Is it the maid?" she said. He could have lied. He could have offered any of the dozen socially acceptable reasons for ending an engagement: incompatibility of temperament, a change of heart, concerns about readiness. He did not lie. "It is what the maid revealed," he said, "about both of us." "And what is that?" "That I was willing to watch someone be humiliated at my table and say nothing, and that you were willing to do the humiliating. I cannot build a household on either of those foundations." She stood. She gathered herself. He watched it happen, the assembly of composure over fury, the smoothing of expression, the straightening of spine, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and cold and perfect. "You will regret this, Benedict. I expect I shall be discussed. I do not expect I shall regret it." She left through the far door. Her maid had the trunks packed by noon. Her carriage departed at 2. Benedict stood at the study window and watched it move down the drive between the lime trees, and felt, not relief, which would have been callous, and not sadness, which would have been dishonest, but the particular lightness of a man who has set down a weight he had been pretending was not heavy. He never saw her again. She went to her mother's house and then to Bath, and then, the following season, she married a baronet from Northumberland and moved to an estate that was, by all accounts, well-appointed and remote. The Tun discussed Benedict's broken engagement for precisely the amount of time the Tun discussed anything, 6 weeks of intense speculation followed by gradual absorption into the general sediment of gossip, and then moved on to newer scandals. He waited. This was perhaps the most difficult thing he had ever done, and he had sat in the House of Lords during debates that lasted 9 hours and had managed the estate through a harvest failure and had held his mother's hand while she died. He waited because he would not court Eliza Dunmore while she was his servant. The disparity of power was absolute. He could not offer her anything while she depended upon him for her bread and her shelter and her position, because acceptance under those circumstances was not choice but necessity, and he would not have her on those terms. He spoke to Mrs. Croft. He spoke to Rawlings. He arranged, quietly and without Eliza's knowledge, for a position to be offered to her by a family in the neighboring county, the Ashtons, who were decent people, and whose household would treat her well, and whose proximity to Oakhurst Hall was close enough that she would not vanish from the county entirely, but far enough that she would be, in every meaningful sense, free of his authority. Eliza accepted the position. She departed Oakhurst Hall on a Thursday morning in late October, carrying a single trunk and wearing the gray wool pelisse she had arrived in 11 months before. Benedict watched from the study window, the same window from which he had watched Lady Arabella leave, and noted that Eliza did not look back at the house. She walked to the waiting cart with the same measured, unhurried step she had used in the dining room on the night everything changed, and she climbed aboard, and the cart moved down the drive, and she was gone. He waited 6 weeks. He wrote to her on the 1st of December, a letter that he drafted 11 times, and that said in its final version only this: that he admired her, that he wished to call upon her if she would permit it, that she was under no obligation of any kind, and that her answer, whatever it was, would be received with respect and would alter nothing about the position she held or the reference he had provided. He signed it with his Christian name, which was either an intimacy or a presumption, and he spent the 4 days between posting the letter and receiving her reply in a state of suspense that he managed to conceal from everyone except Rawlings, who said nothing but set an additional glass of port at dinner without being asked. Her reply was 3 lines long. She would be glad to receive him. Thursday would be convenient. She signed it E. Dunmore, and the formality of the signature made him smile, because it was so completely her, correct, precise, and giving nothing away. He called on Thursday. He called the following Thursday. He called every Thursday for 3 months, and during those 3 months he learned that she could argue a philosophical point with a rigor that made his Oxford tutors look sentimental, that she laughed rarely but genuinely, that she missed her father every day, that her brother's ship was in the Mediterranean and she worried about him constantly, that she could not sing but loved music, that she read before she slept the way other people prayed, and that she held her teacup with both hands when she was thinking, as though the warmth helped her mind work. He proposed on a Thursday in March. She did not answer immediately. She set down her teacup, both hands, and looked at him with the direct, assessing gaze he had come to understand was not boldness but clarity, and said, "You understand what this will mean, for your position, for the way the world will speak of you." "I understand what it will mean," he said. "I have sat in the House of Lords and listened to men debate the governance of nations who could not govern their own households. I am not concerned with what the world will say. I am asking what you will say." "Yes," she said. "I will say yes." They married in June in the chapel at Oakhurst Hall, with the lime trees in full leaf and the light coming through the east windows in long gold bars that laid themselves across the stone floor like offerings. Rawlings stood at the back of the chapel and was observed by Mrs. Croft to wipe his eyes, though he denied it afterward with considerable dignity. Mrs. Croft herself had been seen pressing her handkerchief to her face during the vows, but as no one of sufficient rank had been positioned to observe this, it was never formally acknowledged. The ton talked. Of course the ton talked. A duke had married his housemaid. The word scandal was used freely. The word mésalliance was used more freely. But the ton had talked when he broke his engagement to Lady Arabella, and the ton had talked before that about other things, and the ton would talk afterward about other things still, because that was what the ton did. It processed the lives of others into entertainment and moved on, and the lives themselves continued regardless. Eliza became the Duchess of Oakhurst with the same quiet competence she had brought to everything else. She did not attempt to perform grandeur. She had, Benedict thought, too much genuine substance for performance. But she learned what was required, and she did it well. And the household, which had initially received the news with the particular vibration that runs through a staff when power changes hands unexpectedly, settled quickly because she was fair and because she remembered what it was to carry coal up 3 flights of stairs, and that memory informed her management with a compassion that was not softness, but understanding. She hired a new upper housemaid to replace herself. She visited the tenants with Benedict and spoke to them in plain English, which they preferred, and in one case in Italian, because the tenant farmer's wife was from Naples and had not spoken her own language since her arrival in England 8 years before, and wept when she heard it. She managed the household accounts through Rawlings with a precision that revealed she had been paying closer attention during her 11 months of service than anyone had realized. She read in the library every evening, no longer from the rolling ladder, but from the chair beside the window, and Benedict sat across from her and read his own book, more slowly, and in only one language, and the silence between them was the first kind, comfortable, settled, full. Their first child arrived the following spring, a daughter whom they named Josephine after Eliza's father, Josiah, because Eliza believed that the name of a good man should not disappear from the world simply because the world had not valued him sufficiently while he lived. Their second, a son, arrived 2 years later and was christened Thomas, a name that belonged to no one in either family, but which Eliza had always liked for its plainness and solidity. And Benedict had agreed because he had learned, slowly, thoroughly, and with considerable pleasure, that Eliza's judgment on most things was better than his own. The boy learned his letters early. The girl learned hers earlier. Eliza taught them both, not because she distrusted tutors, but because she believed, as her father had believed, that the teaching of language was not pedagogy, but love, and that the first voice a child heard shaping words in a new tongue should be a voice the child trusted. By the time Josephine was 6, she could read French and was beginning Latin. Thomas, at 4, could count to 20 in Italian and liked to do so at meals, loudly, which Eliza permitted, and Benedict pretended to find excessive but did not. Lady Arabella's name was mentioned occasionally in letters from London. She had married her baronet. She lived in Northumberland. She was, by all accounts, comfortable and handsome and admired in the local society, which was smaller than the one she had been raised to inhabit, but which suited her well enough. Benedict bore her no ill will. He did not think of her often. When he did, it was not with regret, but with a kind of distant gratitude, for the dinner, for the laugh, for the moment in which the wrong thing revealed the right one. On an evening in their 5th year of marriage, Benedict came into the library and found Eliza at her chair with a letter in her hand and tears on her face. Her brother's ship had returned safely from the Mediterranean. He had been promoted. He was coming to visit. Benedict sat beside her and took her hand and said nothing, because there were moments when silence was not absence, but presence, and this was one of them. The candles burned low. Through the window, the lime trees stood in their summer fullness, dark against a sky that was not yet dark, that held the last light of the day the way a cupped hand holds water, gently, briefly, knowing it will go. Eliza leaned her head against his shoulder. He rested his chin against her hair. Somewhere above them, Josephine was supposed to be sleeping and was almost certainly reading by the light of the candle she believed her parents did not know she kept beneath her pillow. Thomas was dreaming of counting in Italian. The house was quiet. The house was full. There are those who find what they were meant to find quickly, in the expected places, through the expected doors. And there are those who find it the way one finds a passage in a foreign text, slowly, with difficulty, with the help of someone who can read what you cannot, who translates the world into a language you understand. The second way is longer. It is less certain. But the meaning, when it arrives, is unmistakable, because you have worked for it, and because the person who helped you find it is standing beside you still, and because the words, in every language, are the same. They arrive here, like borrowed books returned to the shelf they were always meant to occupy whenever they are ready.